He buried his heart the day death came to his door. A wife, gone. A child who never drew a breath. The silence in his cabin was a tomb, and he was its keeper. Years passed. The cold in his chest never thawed. The folks in town called him the stone-hearted cowboy. He didn't argue. Fear was a better shield than pity. His life was simple. Chores, whiskey, silence. The land was like him, harsh, unforgiving. So when the blizzard rolled in, he thought it was just another storm to survive. But the wind has a way of changing things. Riding back from the North Ridge, he saw them. Footprints. Small, stumbling, desperate. He should have ignored them. Let the snow do its work. It wasn't his business. It wasn't his problem. He had no more room for saving anyone. But he followed them anyway, because something in their desperation felt familiar. The trail ended under a storm-bent cedar, and there she was. A woman, clutching a swollen belly, frost in her dark hair. Her eyes, half closed, burned with a fire that cut him to the bone. He slid from his horse. He could still walk away, leave her to the storm and the gods she prayed to. He had buried his own family. He had no right to start another story. He told himself she was a ghost, a trick of the wind. But then she tried to stand, and a sound tore from her throat. Not a cry, not a plea, a prayer, a sound that cracked the ice around his soul. Before he could think, his arms were around her. She was light as a frozen bird. She fought for a second, then collapsed against him, all the fight gone. The horse carried them both back, her head against his chest. He said nothing, offered no words of comfort. But she could feel the steady beat of his heart, a rhythm he thought had stopped years ago. Back in the cabin, he laid her by the fire, wrapped her in his last clean wool blanket. She was native, that much was clear. In town, that was a dangerous truth to carry. He watched her, this stranger fighting for two lives, and the silence in his cabin felt different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was waiting. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls. She was barely conscious, her breath a fragile cloud in the cold air. He set bread and water beside her, his movements stiff, unfamiliar with care. He was a man who broke things, fences, horses, his own life. He didn't fix them. For a long time, he just stood there, a ghost in his own home, watching another ghost fight her way back to life. Then, her voice, a faint whisper against the roar of the wind outside. "I will not let them take you, little one." Her hand moved, a slow, protective sweep over her belly, to soothe the child within. The words weren't for him, but they hit him like a physical blow. A memory, sharp and cruel, tore through him. His own wife, whispering those same words. The ghost of his unborn child filled the room, a pain so raw he thought he'd forgotten how to feel it. She turned her head, her eyes locking onto his, heavy, unwavering. She didn't thank him. She didn't ask his name. She just gave him a tiny nod, a nod of recognition, as if she saw the tomb he lived in and understood. He jerked his chin in reply, then turned back to the fire, his hands shaking. Words were a dangerous country. He had no passport. The days that followed were a blur of snow and silence, a new kind of silence. She moved about the cabin with a quiet grace, her presence a soft hum against the sharp edges of his grief. He never saw her sleep, but he'd find a blanket neatly folded, the floor swept clean. She never asked about the empty cradle collecting dust in the corner. She never asked about the woman in the faded photograph on the mantel. Her acceptance was a blade, slowly, carefully, cutting away the scar tissue around his heart. One morning, he heard her humming. A low, haunting melody that seemed to wrap around the cabin's rafters and squeeze. He dropped the wood he was splitting, his hands suddenly weak. The tune was foreign, yet it spoke a language of loss he knew all too well. It was then he realized something terrifying. He was listening for it, waiting for it. The town began to notice. At the general store, Old Man Hemlock raised a gray eyebrow when he bought extra flour and soft linen. Expecting company, Silas? The question was casual, but the meaning was sharp as a branding iron. Rumors started to drift like smoke from a winter chimney. The stone-hearted cowboy had taken in a woman, a native woman. He ignored the whispers, but they followed him home, clinging to him like the cold. That night, the wind howled a lonely song. He watched her by the fire, her hand resting on her stomach, and a feeling he couldn't name twisted in his gut. It wasn't pity. It was something far more dangerous. It was hope. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it would destroy him. Winter started to lose its grip, but the chill inside Silas held firm. The snow melted into a muddy slush, and with the thaw, she grew stronger. He learned her name was Alara. He never asked. She offered it one evening, her voice as soft as the firelight. He just nodded. It was more than he'd said to anyone in years. He caught himself watching her, the way she moved, the way her eyes would follow a bird outside the window. He started leaving dried fruit where she might find it. He bought tea leaves in town, though he hated the stuff. He told himself it was just a debt. He'd saved her life, now he was keeping her alive. Simple as that. But the prairie knows a liar when it sees one. One night, the silence finally broke. She sat staring into the flames, her hands cradling her belly. "They cast me out," she said, her voice flat, devoid of self-pity. "My own people." She spoke of a man who had promised her everything, then abandoned her when he learned of the child. Dishonored, she'd fled, seeking a place where her child wouldn't be born into shame. She didn't cry. Her strength was a quiet, unmovable mountain. He listened, his jaw so tight it ached. Her story wasn't his, but it was. A broken promise, a stolen future, a family that never was. The words were right there, on the tip of his tongue. I know. I understand. But they turned to ash in his mouth. Instead, he reached for a log and added it to the fire. The unspoken filled the space between them, and in that moment, he realized the cabin wasn't his tomb anymore. It had become a shelter for two broken souls, and he was terrified of what would happen when one of them was strong enough to leave. The first sign of spring was a fragile green shoot pushing through the mud. It was also a signal. One morning she stood by the door, a small bundle in her hands. "I cannot stay," she said, not looking at him. "The town, they talk. It is not safe for you." Her words were a clean cut, straight to his heart. He didn't protest, he didn't argue. He just gave a stiff nod, his face a mask of stone. He was the stone-hearted cowboy, after all. He was good at this, at letting go, at being alone. He turned his back so she wouldn't see the storm gathering in his eyes. She left at dawn, a small, solitary figure against a vast, empty sky. The silence she left behind was louder than any storm. It screamed, it echoed, it clawed at the walls. He told himself it was for the best. This was his life. Alone. But his eyes kept drifting to the small, folded piece of paper she'd left on the mantel. His hand trembled as he reached for it. He didn't open it. Not for hours. He paced the cabin like a caged wolf, the paper burning a hole in the table where he'd set it down. To read it was to admit she was real. That the last few weeks weren't just a fever dream. That the warmth he'd started to feel wasn't just the fire. As night fell, he finally surrendered. He unfolded the paper. Her handwriting was careful, deliberate. The words were few, but they carried the weight of a lifetime. She thanked him, not for the food or the roof, but for his silence. "In your quiet, I found safety. In your presence, I remembered I was not worthless." The words blurred. A strange heat pricked his eyes. Then he read the last line. "You asked for nothing, but you gave my child his first gift. Kindness. If you ever wonder if you have a family, know that you were ours. A single tear fell, then another. The dam he'd built around his heart for years didn't just crack. It shattered. The grief hit him like a physical force, knocking the air from his lungs. He hadn't cried since the day he'd lowered his wife and child into the frozen earth. But this was different. This wasn't just sorrow. It was the agonizing pain of a heart starting to beat again. He clutched the letter, the paper crinkling in his fist. He couldn't let her go. He couldn't go back to the silence. It would kill him this time. For real. Before the sun was fully up, he was on his horse, the letter tucked inside his coat, a warm spot against the cold in his chest. He rode hard, the wind whipping at his face. He followed the faint trail she'd left in the mud, a fragile line connecting his past to a future he hadn't dared to imagine. Each hoofbeat was a word he'd failed to say. Stay, please. Don't go. He pushed the horse faster, his knuckles white on the reins. The prairie stretched on, vast and empty. What if he was too late? What if the wilderness had already claimed her? Doubt gnawed at him, a cold, familiar poison. But he pushed it down. He had to try. Then he saw her, a small shape in the distance, walking with a slow, determined rhythm. She heard the horse and turned, her eyes wide with disbelief and something else. Fear? He pulled the horse to a halt, the animal snorting and stamping. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving. The words. He needed the words. For the first time in years, his voice, raw and cracked with disuse, broke free. Come home. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a command. It was a prayer. A simple, undeniable truth. Tears streamed down her face, but she was smiling. Her hand went to her belly. Then, slowly, she reached for the hand he offered her. The moment their fingers touched, the last wall inside him crumbled to dust. There, under the vast open sky, the stone-hearted cowboy was gone, and the man he was meant to be was finally, terrifyingly, alive. They rode back together, the space between them filled with an unspoken promise. The cabin, once a tomb, now felt like a sanctuary, a home. The rhythm of their lives settled into a quiet harmony. He'd chop wood, and she'd hum that haunting tune. He'd fix a fence and find a warm meal waiting for him. He started talking more. Small words at first. About the weather. About the horse. Then, one evening, he told her their names. Sarah and Daniel. He pointed to the faded photograph on the mantel. He spoke of them not as ghosts, but as memories. And Alara listened, her hand resting on his arm, a silent anchor in the storm of his past. He had never felt so exposed, or so strong, but the prairie holds its breath before a storm. The whispers in town hadn't died down. They'd festered. When Silas rode in for supplies, the silence that fell over the general store was heavier than any snowdrift. Old Man Hemlock served him without a word, his eyes cold and hard. The other ranchers, men he'd known his whole life, turned their backs. They saw Alara not as a woman, but as a threat, a violation of their unspoken rules. As he was leaving, Sheriff Brody stopped him, a big man with a weary face. Silas, he said, his voice low, you need to be careful. There's talk, ugly talk. Silas just nodded, his hand resting on the rifle in its scabbard. Let them talk. But it wasn't just talk. One afternoon, a lone rider appeared on the horizon. He wasn't from around here. He sat his horse with an easy arrogance, his clothes too clean for the trail. He rode straight into town and started asking questions. Questions about a native woman. Pregnant. Alone. He had a charming smile and eyes as cold as a snake's. His name, he said, was Cale, and he was looking for what was his. Cale was smooth. He walked into the saloon and bought a round for the house. He had a way of talking that made men lean in, made them feel important. He told a story, a sad story, about a girl he'd loved, a good girl from a proud tribe who'd been led astray. She's confused, Cale said, his voice laced with false sorrow. Got some wild ideas in her head. I'm just here to bring her home, back where she belongs. He painted a picture of Silas as a lonely, desperate man who'd taken advantage of a vulnerable woman, a kidnapper. The ranchers, already suspicious, drank it all in. Fear and prejudice are a potent whiskey. They started seeing what they wanted to see. A good-for-nothing cowboy defiling their town with an outsider. The whispers turned into murmurs, the murmurs into threats. Sheriff Brody watched it all, his gut twisting. He knew Silas, knew the tragedy that had hollowed him out. This didn't feel right. But Cale was smart. He never raised his voice. He just planted seeds of doubt and let them grow in the dark soil of their minds. Back at the cabin, Silas and Ilara knew nothing of the serpent charming their neighbors. Their world had shrunk to the four walls of the cabin, to the steady rhythm of the coming child's kicks. They were building something fragile and new, a small pocket of peace against the harshness of the world. They thought they were safe, but Cale wasn't just talking. He was watching. From a ridge overlooking the cabin, he lowered his spyglass, a cruel smile playing on his lips. He saw Silas place a gentle hand on Ilara's belly. The smile vanished. It was replaced by a look of pure, possessive rage. He wasn't here to rescue her. He was here to reclaim his property. The first sign of real trouble was the fence, the northern line, the one Silas had just mended. Cut clean through, not by weather, not by cattle, by a wire cutter. It was a message. I can get to you. He spent the day repairing it, his back rigid, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. The piece they'd found felt thin, brittle. That night, he cleaned his rifle by the fire, the metallic click of the bolt echoing in the quiet cabin. Ilara watched him, her eyes dark with a fear she tried to hide. He found me, she whispered. It wasn't a question. Who is he? Silas asked, his voice a low growl. His name is Kyle, she said, her voice trembling slightly. The man I told you about, the child's father. She told him more now, that Kyle wasn't just a scorned lover. He was a man obsessed with bloodlines, with purity. Her family had standing, land. Kyle wanted it. The child was his claim. He doesn't love me, she said, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. He wants an heir, an object. He said if the child wasn't perfect, he would. She couldn't finish the sentence. A cold fury, colder than any winter, settled in Silas's bones. This wasn't about town gossip anymore. This was about a monster at his door. The next morning, he found a dead raven on his doorstep, a single black feather tied to its leg with a strip of red cloth. It was a tribal sign, a symbol of a blood debt. Kyle wasn't just sending a message anymore. He was making a promise of death. Sheriff Brody rode out 2 days later. He didn't come as a friend. He came as the law. He looked tired, his face etched with a conflict he couldn't resolve. Silas, he said, avoiding Ilara's gaze, a man named Cale came to see me. He has papers. Silas's blood ran cold. What kind of papers? A warrant, Brody said, pulling a folded document from his coat. From the tribal council, countersigned by a federal judge. It says she's a runaway, that she stole property. It gives him the authority to bring her back. Silas stared at the official-looking paper. The stamps, the signatures, it looked real, too real. It's a lie, Ilara said, her voice shaking but firm. She stepped forward from the doorway, her presence commanding. He has twisted our laws. He has bribed men. This is not justice. Brody looked at her, then back at Silas. My hands are tied, Silas. The law is the law. He's giving you until sundown tomorrow to hand her over. After that, he's coming with a posse. A posse. The word hung in the air, thick and ugly. Their neighbors, the men he'd known his whole life, turned into a lynch mob by a stranger's lies and a piece of paper. You can't let him, Silas said, his voice dangerously quiet. You know me, Brody. You know this is wrong. What I know doesn't matter, the sheriff said, his eyes full of regret. All that matters is this paper. Don't make me come back here with them, Silas. Don't make me do it. He turned and rode away, leaving Silas and Alara standing in the shadow of a ticking clock. The law wasn't on their side. They were alone, utterly and completely alone. And the sun was already starting to dip toward the horizon. As dusk painted the sky in shades of blood and rust, Silas paced the cabin floor. Every instinct screamed at him to fight, to barricade the door and meet Cale's posse with hot lead. But what then? He couldn't win against the whole town. Not forever. He would die. And Alara and the child would be taken by that monster. There had to be another way. A flaw in the story. A crack in the lie. He's clever, Alara said, her voice pulling him from his dark thoughts. Kyle always finds a way to make the truth serve him. Tell me about the warrant, Silas said, stopping in front of her. The property it says you stole. Alara's brow furrowed. It's a ceremonial bracelet. It has been in my mother's family for generations. Cale always coveted it. He said it should belong to his wife. Her eyes widened. But I don't have it. What do you mean? I left it behind, she said, her voice gaining speed. When I fled, I took nothing of value. Nothing that could be tracked. I left it in the hollow of the old willow tree, by the river. It's our family's secret place. Kyle doesn't know about it. A flicker of hope ignited in Silas's chest, a small, dangerous spark. If you don't have it, then you couldn't have stolen it, he said, thinking aloud. The charge is a lie. Of course it's a lie, she said, but how do we prove it? His eyes darted around the cabin, landing on the faded photograph of Sarah. She had been smart, a planner. She always saw the details everyone else missed. What would she do? The answer came to him in a rush. Cale's story was too perfect, too clean. A man like that, a man who planned everything, would have made a mistake. A small one. Something he overlooked. He looked at the warrant again in his mind's eye. The signatures, the stamps. He had only glanced at it. The judge, Silas said, his voice tight with excitement. What was his name? Sheriff Brody hadn't said, but it was on the paper. Why? Alara asked. Because judges don't sign warrants on the open range, Silas said, a grim smile touching his lips for the first time in days. They sign them in a courthouse, and the nearest federal courthouse is 300 miles from here. There's no way Kyle could have ridden there and back in time to meet the sheriff. The warrant wasn't just a lie. It was a forgery, and he knew just how to prove it. There was no time to lose. Sundown tomorrow. That gave him less than 24 hours. I have to ride to town, he told Alara. I need to get a look at that warrant again. It's too dangerous, she pleaded. Cale will be there. The town is against you. It's the only way. He grabbed his coat, his rifle. He paused at the door, turning to face her. The fear in her eyes was a physical pain in his chest. Barricade the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone, not even Brody. Shoot through the door if you have to. She nodded, her chin set with determination. He saw the fighter in her, the woman who had survived the wilderness. She could survive one night. He kissed her then. A rough, desperate kiss that tasted of fear and hope. It was the first time. It might be the last. Then he was gone, melting into the pre-dawn darkness. The ride to town was a gauntlet of shadows and imagined threats. Every rustle of leaves, every coyote's howl sounded like the click of a rifle hammer. He avoided the main road, sticking to the gullies and ridges, his horse moving like a phantom through the landscape. He tethered the horse in a thicket a mile from town and went the rest of the way on foot, moving with a hunter's stealth he hadn't used in years. Town was quiet, but it was a tense, watchful quiet. Lights burned in the saloon, where Cale was no doubt cementing his lies. The sheriff's office was dark, save for a single lamp burning on Brody's desk. Silas crept through the alleyways, his heart pounding against his ribs. The window to the office was unlocked, a foolish oversight by a tired man. He slid it open, slipped inside, and held his breath. The warrant was sitting right there, on top of a stack of papers. He grabbed it, his hands shaking as he held it up to the lamplight. The name of the judge was there, just as he'd thought. Judge Alastair Finch, District of Nevada. A 3-week ride from here, one way. It was an impossible timeline. It was a fake. But as he scanned the rest of the document, his blood turned to ice. It wasn't just the judge's signature that was a forgery. It was the other name. The name of the tribal elder who had supposedly issued the complaint. It was Alara's father. And Silas knew, from the way she spoke of him, that he was 2 years dead. This changed everything. Kyle hadn't just bribed an elder. He had desecrated the name of a dead man. He hadn't just forged a judge's signature. He'd constructed an entire reality built on lies. This was a man with no honor, no limits. The creak of a floorboard outside the office door sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through him. He shoved the warrant in his coat and dove back out the window just as the door opened. "Who's there?" Sheriff Brody's voice boomed. Silas didn't wait to answer. He sprinted through the alley, his boots pounding the dirt. A shout erupted behind him. Then a gunshot, the bullet whining past his ear. The town exploded into a hornet's nest of noise. Men poured out of the saloon, guns in hand. Kyle's voice rose above the din, calm and commanding. "He's over there! The kidnapper! He's trying to escape!" It was a trap. Kyle had known he would come for the warrant. He'd been waiting for him. Silas ran, zigzagging through the backlots, the sounds of the posse hot on his heels. They were shouting his name, their voices twisted with anger and fear. These were men he knew, men he'd shared drinks with, worked alongside. Now, they were hunting him like an animal. He made it to his horse, vaulting into the saddle as another bullet splintered the tree beside his head. He dug his heels in, and the horse surged forward, back into the dark sanctuary of the wilderness. He had the proof. He had the forged warrant in his coat. But he was riding away from the law, a wanted man, with a lynch mob baying for his blood. He had won the battle for the truth, but in doing so, he had just started a war. He rode like the devil was on his tail, because he was. Cale was no fool. He would know exactly where Silas was headed. The cabin wasn't a sanctuary anymore. It was a bullseye. When he burst through the door, Alara was waiting, rifle in hand, her face pale but resolute. "They're coming," he said, breathless, shoving the barricade back in place. "The whole town." He showed her the warrant, showed her the name of her dead father. A look of profound grief and rage passed over her features. "He would dare?" she whispered. "He would do anything," Silas said, checking his ammunition. "There's no reasoning with them. Not now. We have to hold them off." They didn't have to wait long. As the first light of dawn broke over the prairie, they appeared, a ring of riders on the ridge, dark silhouettes against the rising sun. At the front were Cale and Sheriff Brody. The posse spread out, surrounding the small cabin, their rifles gleaming. Brody's voice carried on the morning air, amplified by a bullhorn. "Silas, it's over. Come out with your hands up. Don't make this any harder than it has to be." "He's lying," Silas shouted back, his voice raw. "The warrant is a fake. Cale forged it." There was a pause. He could imagine Brody turning to Cale, the doubt warring with his duty. Then Cale's smooth, confident voice cut through the air. "He's a desperate man. He attacked the sheriff's office, stole official documents. Can't you see? He's lost his mind." The posse shifted, their rifles raising. They believed him. Of course they did. Cale's story was simpler. It was easier. Silas was the broken man, the stone-hearted cowboy. It was easier to believe he'd finally snapped. The first shot wasn't a warning. It slammed into the wooden wall just inches from the window, showering the room with splinters. The siege had begun. They were pinned down. Bullets chewed at the logs of the cabin, the windows exploding in showers of glass. Silas and Alara moved low, crawling from one side of the single room to the other, firing back sparingly, conserving ammunition. He was a good shot, but he wasn't aiming to kill. He was aiming for belt buckles, for hats, for the ground in front of their horses. He just needed to buy time. But for what? He had the proof in his pocket, but it was worthless if he couldn't get it to someone who would listen. Brody was a lost cause, trapped by his own sense of duty and Cale's lies. Outside, the posse was getting restless. They were ranchers, not soldiers. They wanted a quick end to this. But Silas was a stubborn man, and his cabin was a fortress he'd built with his own 2 hands. Hours crawled by. The sun climbed higher in the sky. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with gunpowder and tension. They were running low on water. And then, a new sound. A low moan from Alara. Silas turned, his heart stopping. She was leaning against the wall, her face slick with sweat, her hands clutching her belly. "The baby," she gasped, her eyes wide with a mixture of pain and terror. "It's coming. Now!" Of all the moments, of all the God-forsaken times, the child had chosen this one, in the middle of a gunfight, to enter the world. The gunfire outside seemed to fade into a dull roar. The entire world shrank to Alara's pained face. He was trapped, surrounded by men who wanted him dead, and the woman he had just begun to love was about to give birth. He had faced death before, he had faced grief. But this was a whole new kind of hell. Panic seized him, cold and sharp. He knew nothing about delivering a baby. He had been there for Sarah, but the doctor had handled everything. His role had been to hold her hand, to whisper encouragement. It had ended in a silent, blood-soaked tragedy. The memory threatened to paralyze him. "Silas," Ilara's voice cut through his fear, sharp and commanding despite the pain. "Water, and the linen you bought. Now." The order snapped him back to reality. He scrambled to get what she needed. The gunfire outside was a constant, terrifying rhythm. A bullet punched through the roof, sending a shower of dust and debris down on them. A contraction racked Ilara's body, and she cried out, biting her lip to keep from screaming. Silas knelt beside her, wiping her forehead with a damp cloth. He felt utterly, hopelessly useless. He had a rifle in his hands, but he couldn't shoot away her pain. He had a forged warrant in his pocket, but he couldn't use it to bargain for her life. He looked out the shattered window at the men crouched behind rocks and wagons. They had families, wives, children. Did they have any idea what was happening in here? He had to make them listen. He had to make them see past Cale's lies. He crawled to the door. "Brody!" he yelled, his voice cracking. "Sheriff, the baby is coming! She's in labor!" There was a brief lull in the shooting. He could hear murmurs from the posse. He had their attention. Then Cale's voice, smooth as oil, slick with poison. "Another trick! He's using the woman to play on your sympathies. Don't listen to him." The shooting started again, more intense this time. They didn't believe him. They thought it was a lie, just another desperate act from a desperate man. But one person had heard him, and one person was starting to doubt. Sheriff Brody lowered his rifle. He had seen Ilara's belly. He was a father himself. He knew what labor looked like, sounded like, and the cry he'd heard from the cabin. It wasn't the cry of a trickster. It was the cry of a woman in agony. He looked at Cale, really looked at him for the first time, at the cold, merciless glint in his eyes, and a single terrible question began to form in his mind. What if Silas was telling the truth? Sheriff Brody held up a hand. "Hold your fire!" he bellowed. The shooting sputtered and died out. The sudden silence was deafening. "What are you doing?" Cale hissed, his charming facade cracking for the first time. "He's lying." "Maybe," Brody said, his eyes never leaving the cabin door. "But if he's not..." If there's a woman in there giving birth, I won't have this on my conscience. He turned to one of the ranchers, a man named Jeb, whose wife had just had their 5th child. Jeb, you remember what it was like with Martha? The sounds. Jeb shifted uncomfortably, his gaze dropping. He's right, Cale. It did sound like that. A seed of doubt once planted grows fast. The other men in the posse started looking at each other. They were here to uphold the law, to capture a kidnapper, not to lay siege to a birth. Cale saw his control slipping. He had to act. Fine, he snarled, his voice tight with fury. If you've all lost your nerve, I'll end this myself. He raised his rifle, taking careful aim at the cabin door. He wasn't going to wait for them. He would finish Silas, take the woman and the child, and be gone before their consciences could catch up. But before he could pull the trigger, Brody stepped in front of him. No, the sheriff said, his voice quiet but unyielding. We're done here. We're going to wait. Cale's eyes blazed with hatred. Get out of my way, old man. This is my town, Brody said, his hand dropping to the butt of his pistol. And my call. The two men stared each other down, a silent battle of wills under the harsh prairie sun. The posse watched, frozen, unsure of who to follow. The man with the fancy piece of paper, or the sheriff they had trusted their entire lives. Inside the cabin, Silas heard the ceasefire. He didn't know why, but it was the chance he needed. Ilara was in the final stages, her breathing shallow, her strength fading. He had to trust Brody. He had to trust that some glimmer of the man he knew was still in there. He ripped a piece of his shirt, found a charcoal pencil, and started to write. His hand shook as he wrote. He wasn't writing to Brody. He was writing to the posse. To Jeb, to Marcus, to all the men out there with families of their own. Her name is Ilara. The man outside is Cale. He is the father of the child being born right now. He abandoned her, left her to die in a snowstorm. I found her. That is my only crime. He told them about the forged warrant, about her dead father's name. Look at the warrant, the date, the judge. Ask Brody. He knows it's a lie. Cale is not here for justice. He is here for a child he sees as property. Ask yourselves, is this the law you want in your town? Is this the kind of man you want to be? He tied the note to a small rock. He crawled to the broken window. Brody! He yelled. I'm throwing something out. It's for the men. He tossed the rock. It landed in the dirt a few feet from the front line. For a long moment, no one moved. Cale started to laugh, a harsh, ugly sound. A love letter? How touching! But Brody walked forward. He picked up the rock, untied the note. He read it, his face grim. Then, without a word, he passed it to Jeb. Jeb read it, and his face, which had been set in a hard line of certainty, began to soften. He passed it to the next man. The note moved through the posse, a silent testament against the man who had lied to them. They looked from the paper, to Kyle, to the cabin. Inside, they could hear the unmistakable high-pitched cry of a newborn baby. Cale's face was a mask of thunderous rage. He had lost them. The lies had unraveled. Fools! He screamed. He's tricked you all! He raised his rifle again, but this time he wasn't aiming at the cabin. He was aiming at Sheriff Brody. The shot was deafening in the sudden quiet. Sheriff Brody stumbled back, clutching his shoulder, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. Cale had crossed the line. He had fired on the law. Any sympathy the posse had for him evaporated in that single, violent moment. They raised their own rifles, but they weren't pointed at the cabin anymore. They were pointed at Kyle. You're all traitors! Kyle shrieked, his composure completely gone. He was backing away, his eyes wild, his charming facade melted away to reveal the monster beneath. She is mine. The child is mine. My bloodline. He was trapped. The hunters had become the hunted, but he had one more card to play. He grabbed a stick of dynamite from his saddlebag, something he'd brought to flush Silas out. He lit the fuse. "Stay back!" he screamed, holding the hissing dynamite aloft. "Let me go, or we all die." The posse froze. This was madness, sheer, unadulterated madness. Cale backed toward his horse, his eyes darting between the men in front of him and the cabin behind him. He intended to get away, but Silas had seen it all through the broken window. He knew Kyle wouldn't just leave. He would take his revenge. He would throw the dynamite at the cabin, at Alara, at his own child. Silas didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle, took a deep breath, and centered the sights on the small, burning fuse. It was an impossible shot. 100 yards, a moving target, a gusting wind. He thought of Sarah. He thought of Daniel. He thought of the new life, the new hope, that lay crying in the room behind him. He squeezed the trigger. The crack of his rifle echoed across the prairie. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, the stick of dynamite in Cale's hand simply vanished in a small, contained puff of smoke and sparks. Silas hadn't hit the dynamite. He had hit the fuse. He had shot the fire out of the sky. Cale stood there stunned, holding a useless stick of dynamite. The posse, recovering from their shock, surged forward. He dropped the dynamite and made a desperate scramble for his horse, but it was too late. Jeb tackled him, bringing him down in a cloud of dust. The fight was over. As the men tied Cale's hands, Silas finally lowered his rifle, his arms trembling from the strain. He turned back to the room. Alara was propped against the wall, exhausted, but radiant. In her arms, wrapped in a piece of soft linen, was a small, perfect baby boy. He had his mother's dark hair. He looked at Silas, his tiny fists clenched, his eyes wide and curious. Silas knelt down, his rough fingers gently touching the baby's cheek. All the cold, all the grief, all the years of silence melted away in that single touch. A feeling so powerful, so overwhelming, washed over him. It wasn't just hope. It was love. Pure, unconditional, and utterly terrifying. He had a son. The cabin door creaked open. Sheriff Brody stood there, his arm in a makeshift sling, his face pale but his eyes clear. He looked at Cale, tied and defeated. He looked at the baby in Alara's arms. Then he looked at Silas. "I reckon," the sheriff said, his voice raspy, "that we owe you an apology." He took off his hat, and one by one, the other men of the posse did the same. It was a silent admission, a gesture of respect, a new beginning. The stone-hearted cowboy was dead and buried, and in his place stood a father. The aftermath was quiet. Cale was taken to the town jail, his insane ramblings about bloodlines and property echoing through the streets until Brody finally shut him in a cell. The posse dispersed, the men riding home with heavy consciences and a story they would tell their grandchildren. Brody stayed behind to take their statements. He sat at the small table in the cabin, sipping water, his eyes keep drifting to the baby sleeping in a makeshift cradle Silas had repaired. He looked at the forged warrant, the evidence of a crime far deeper than kidnapping. "The tribal council will want him," Brody said, "and the feds will want him for forging that judge's signature. He'll be gone a long time." "Good," was all Silas said. The word felt inadequate. He wanted Cale to suffer, to feel a fraction of the terror he had inflicted on Alara. But looking at his new son, revenge felt like a hollow, useless thing. All that mattered was right here, inside these four walls. Alara was healing. The town doctor, a gruff old man with surprisingly gentle hands, had come out to check on her and the baby. He declared them both healthy, though he left Silas with a stern warning to let Alara rest. The women of the town, led by Jeb's wife, Martha, began to appear at the cabin. They came bearing gifts: a warm stew, fresh-baked bread, a hand-knitted blanket. They didn't speak of the siege. They spoke of the baby. They cooed over his dark hair, his strong lungs. They offered advice to Alara, woman to woman. Their quiet acceptance was a balm, slowly healing the wounds of the town's betrayal. Silas watched from a distance, uncomfortable with the sudden warmth, the intrusion into his quiet world. But he saw the way Alara's face lit up, the way she relaxed in their company. And he knew this was necessary. They couldn't live on an island forever. For the first time, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long, long time, a sense of community, a sense of belonging. But as he watched his son sleep, a new fear began to creep in, a fear far worse than any posse. Cale was a man of influence and wealth. His family was powerful. A jail cell might not hold him forever. And men like that, they never forgot a grudge. The peace they had found was real, but Silas knew, deep in his bones, that it was as fragile as a pane of glass in a hailstorm. Weeks turned into a month. The baby, whom Alara named Chayton, meaning falcon in her tongue, grew stronger every day. The rhythm of life in the cabin became a gentle melody of feedings, soft humming, and the quiet creak of the rocking chair. Silas found himself smiling. He'd catch his own reflection and be startled by the stranger looking back at him. The hard lines around his eyes softened. He was happy. The town seemed to have forgotten the siege, or at least they had chosen to file it away. He and Alara were greeted with friendly nods when they rode in for supplies. The whispers had stopped. It was a fragile peace, but it was peace. Then the letter arrived. It came with the circuit rider, an official-looking envelope from a law firm back east. It wasn't addressed to Silas. It was addressed to Alara. She read it, her face growing pale. "They're fighting it," she said, her voice a hollow whisper. "Cale's family. They've hired lawyers. They claim the warrant was valid, that Sheriff Brody acted illegally. They're demanding Cale's release." Silas felt a familiar cold dread seep back into his bones. "They can't," he said. "The warrant was a forgery." "They claim it was a clerical error," Alara said, her hand trembling as she held the letter. "They say my father signed a complaint before he died, and it was simply misfiled. They are challenging my fitness as a mother. They are petitioning the court to grant them custody of Chayton." The words hit Silas harder than any bullet. Custody. They wanted to take his son. Cale had lost the battle, so now his family was starting a new war. A war of paper and ink, fought in a courtroom hundreds of miles away where their money and influence meant more than the truth. They wouldn't send a posse this time. They would send a man with a piece of paper, backed by the full force of the United States government. A piece of paper that would steal their child and send him back to the very people who had tried to have his mother killed. The serpent wasn't dead. It had just shed its skin. The legal battle was a nightmare. Letters went back and forth, filled with accusations and lies. Kyle's family painted Alara as an unstable, immoral woman. They painted Silas as a violent recluse who had brainwashed her. They had money, power, and a dozen witnesses willing to say whatever they were paid to say. Silas and Alara had only the truth, and the truth felt small and weak against such a powerful tide of deceit. Their savings dwindled as they paid for their own lawyer, a weary but determined man in the territorial capital. Hope began to fade. The joy they had found in their new family was being poisoned by fear. One night, Silas sat by the fire, staring at the faded photograph of Sarah. He felt like a failure. He had failed to protect her, and now he was failing to protect Alara and Chayton. He was just a simple rancher. How could he fight against men who could buy the law itself? He picked up the photograph. He hadn't looked at it closely in years. The pain was too much. But now, he looked. He looked at Sarah's smile, at the hope in her eyes, and he noticed something he'd never seen before. Tucked into the corner of the frame, almost completely hidden, was a small folded piece of paper. His fingers, clumsy with emotion, worked it free. It was a letter. In Sarah's handwriting. He unfolded it. his heart pounding. It was dated just a week before she died. "My dearest Silas," it began, "if you are reading this, it means the worst has happened. There is something I never told you about my family. We are not simple farmers. My father, before he came west seeking a quiet life, was a lawyer, a very good one. He made powerful enemies. One of them was a man named Sterling Thorne. The name hit Silas like a physical blow. Sterling Thorne was the name of Cale's father, the patriarch of the family trying to steal his son. Thorne was a criminal, a monster who built his empire on ruin. My father gathered evidence against him, enough to send him to prison for life. But before he could testify, Thorne's men staged an accident. My father was killed. The evidence was lost, or so Thorne believes. Silas's hands were shaking so badly he could barely read the next lines. My father was clever. He knew Thorne might come after him. He made a copy of the evidence. He gave it to me for safekeeping, the day before our wedding. He made me promise to keep it hidden, to only use it if my life was in danger. It is buried in a metal box, under the hearthstone of our fireplace, the one with the crack shaped like a lightning bolt. Silas looked up from the letter, his eyes wide with disbelief. He stared at the fireplace, at the hearth, and at the one stone, right in the middle, with a jagged crack running through it. The perfect shape of a lightning bolt. Sarah hadn't just left him a memory. She had left him a weapon. He didn't sleep. He waited until Alara and Chayton were in a deep slumber, then he went to work. With a crowbar and trembling hands, he pried the stone from the hearth. It was heavy, sealed with mortar and time. Beneath it was a cavity, and inside that, a small, rust-covered metal box. The lock was old and stiff, but he broke it open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a thick ledger and a bundle of letters. He spent the rest of the night reading by candlelight. It was all there. A meticulous record of Sterling Thorne's crimes, extortion, bribery, murder, all detailed in Sarah's father's neat, precise script. There were names, dates, bank records. It was a key that would not only unlock Cale's prison cell, but would dismantle his family's entire empire of lies. It was a ghost's justice, delivered from beyond the grave. The next morning, he showed it to Alara. She read through the documents, her eyes filled with a new, fierce hope. "This changes everything," she said. "This isn't just about Chayton anymore. This is about justice for your wife's family, for all the people the Thornes have destroyed." They knew what they had to do. They couldn't trust the mail. They couldn't trust lawyers. This was evidence that had to be delivered by hand. To the one person they knew they could trust. The one person who had seen the monster behind Cale's mask firsthand. They packed their belongings, boarded up the cabin, and rode out at dawn. They were heading for the territorial capital. They were going to find Sheriff Brody. He had been transferred there after the shooting, given a desk job as a U.S. Marshal. They were bringing him the truth, and they were going to end this once and for all. The city was a sprawling, noisy beast, a world away from the quiet prairie. Finding Marshal Brody wasn't hard. He was a man who commanded respect, even behind a desk. He listened to their story, his face a mask of grim concentration as he examined the ledger. "This is," he began, his voice trailing off as he grasped the sheer scale of the Thornes' criminality. "This is enough to burn them to the ground." But as he spoke, his clerk burst into the room, his face pale. "Marshal, it's Sterling Thorne. He's here, in the city. He's demanding to see you." Silas and Brody exchanged a look. It was a trap. Thorne must have known they were coming. He had spies everywhere. He wasn't going to let that ledger reach the governor's office. "Get Alara and the child out of here," Brody said, his hand already on his gun. "Go out the back. I'll handle Thorne." But Silas shook his head. "No, we're done running. This ends now. Here." Sterling Thorne was an older, more polished version of his son. He walked into the marshal's office, flanked by 2 hired guns, his smile cold and confident. He saw Silas and Alara, and his smile widened. "Well, well," he said. "The happy little family. I've come to collect my grandson." "He's not your grandson," Alara said, her voice ringing with a strength that made Thorn's smile falter. "And you will never touch him." Thorn laughed. "Brave words. But you have nothing. My son will be released. The child will be raised a Thorn. And you," he said, his eyes locking on Silas, "will be a distant, unpleasant memory." "I don't think so," Silas said, stepping forward. He placed the heavy ledger on Brody's desk with a loud thud that echoed in the silent room. "I believe you're familiar with the work of Jonathan Pike." Thorn's face went white. He stared at the ledger, at the familiar handwriting of the man he had murdered decades ago. The color drained from his face. His empire, his legacy, all built on a foundation of crime, was about to crumble. His composure shattered. "Kill them!" he snarled at his men. "Kill them all!" The office erupted into chaos. Brody drew his weapon, firing at one of Thorn's men. Silas shoved Alara and Chayton behind the heavy oak desk and grabbed the shotgun Brody kept on the wall. The second hired gun went down. Only Thorn was left. He made a desperate lunge for the ledger, but Silas was faster. He brought the butt of the shotgun down on Thorn's arm, and the man cried out, collapsing to the floor. It was over. The lies, the running, the fear. It was all over. As other marshals swarmed the office, Silas went to Alara. He knelt down, took her face in his hands, and looked at his son, who had miraculously slept through the entire gunfight. They were safe. They were free. They were a family. The stone-hearted cowboy had ridden through the darkest winter of his soul, but spring had finally come, and in the arms of the woman he loved and the son he would raise, he was finally home. If you were on the edge of your seat through Silas and Alara's journey, hit that subscribe button, because you never know what secrets the prairie is waiting to give up. Thanks for watching.